It all started on what seemed like a typical weekday morning. My husband Jake had left early for work, and I was alone in the house. But this day was different. Today I wasn't alone in my thoughts. There was a sense of anticipation that hung heavy in the air, a flutter of excitement and dread that I could hardly ignore. For weeks now I'd been hiding a secret one that would upend my marriage, and I knew deep down, probably tear apart an entire family. The secret, of course, was Mike, Jake's brother. Our connection had begun harmlessly, almost without my even noticing. Mike had always been around, popping by for dinners and family events, offering to help when things got tough. He was close to Jake, and we all got along well, or so I thought. But as time passed, something shifted between us. Conversations became a bit too personal, glances a little too intense. I felt a strange thrill in his presence that I hadn't felt in years. The flirtation was subtle at first, and I convinced myself it was all in my head. After all, who would ever suspect such a thing? It seemed impossible, almost too taboo to even consider. But one night, everything changed. Jake was out of town for work, and Mike had come over to help me with some house repairs. By the end of the night, a glass of wine in hand, we found ourselves leaning closer than we should have, our laughter filling the empty house. I don't know who made the first move. It felt like some invisible force pulled us together, erasing any boundaries we had once respected. The lines blurred in that instant, and suddenly we were tangled up in something forbidden and exhilarating. The risk was high, but that only seemed to make it all the more alluring. From that night on, we met in secret, hidden away from the world, locked in a web of passion and guilt. We knew it was wrong, yet neither of us could seem to stop. The thrill of sneaking around heightened every encounter, each one more dangerous than the last. Every time we met, I felt a rush that made me forget about the consequences, about the hurt it would cause if anyone found out. Part of me hated myself for what I was doing, for betraying the man who trusted me the most. But another part, the part that craved excitement, couldn't resist. As I waited that day for Mike to arrive, I told myself it would be the last time. I'd convince him that we had to stop before everything fell apart. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The grip of secrecy and temptation was too strong. Little did I know that by the end of that day, my world would spiral out of control in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The moment I heard the sound of keys at the front door, my heart plummeted. Jake. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. My mind raced and panic settled into every inch of my body. This was my worst fear coming true, something I'd pushed out of my mind each time I was with Mike. I had convinced myself we were careful, that we'd never get caught, but in that split second, reality crashed down, and I felt trapped, like a cornered animal with nowhere to hide. I scrambled to throw on my clothes, every second feeling like an eternity. Mike did the same, his face as pale as mine. I could feel the sweat on my forehead, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it would drown out every other sound. All the fears and doubts I'd suppressed flooded my mind in one crushing wave. This wasn't just a close call, this was the ultimate disaster. Every careless moment, every lie I told myself about keeping this under control, now felt like a cruel joke. As Jake walked into the room, the expression on his face was a mix of confusion, anger, and pure devastation. He stopped in his tracks, his gaze darting from me to Mike and back again. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, pieces falling into place in slow motion. The silence was unbearable. I felt like the ground was opening up beneath me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the suffocating tension in the room, but no words came. What could I say to make this right? To justify what I had done? Jake's eyes locked onto mine, and the betrayal in them was like a physical blow. I'd never seen that kind of hurt before. In that instant, I saw him begin to understand the full extent of what he had walked in on, and the impact of that realization was like a dark cloud settling over us. My stomach churned with guilt and shame, but there was also fear of what would happen next. I felt a chill run down my spine as he shifted his gaze to his brother, his face hardening with rage. Mike shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the floor, as though he too was trying to disappear. I could tell he was as trapped as I was, caught in the wreckage of a situation we had both foolishly created. I felt the weight of all the choices I had made press down on me, threatening to crush me completely. The fantasies I'd indulged in felt childish now, mere illusions that vanished in the harsh light of reality. All those stolen moments and whispers in the dark had led to this, a moment of reckoning I couldn't escape. Jake's face twisted with hurt and betrayal, and for the first time I truly understood the depth of my mistake. There was no going back, no quick explanation or apology that could erase what he'd just witnessed. The damage was done, and I was left standing there, exposed and vulnerable, with my world unraveling in front of my eyes. We stood there, frozen, like statues in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Jake's face shifted from shock to an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of anger, pain, and disbelief that tore through me like a knife. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly ashamed. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, the silence in the room so thick it was almost suffocating. I had no idea how to move, what to say, or how to undo what he'd just seen. Every second ticked by, amplifying the reality of what I'd done, and I could feel the last remnants of my world shattering around me. Jake took a step forward, his eyes blazing with hurt, and I could feel his disappointment radiating off him. I wanted to explain, to say something that would make him understand, but the weight of my betrayal made it impossible. My mind raced with half-formed thoughts, excuses, and apologies, but nothing seemed enough. How could I possibly justify this? There was nothing I could say that would erase the image of his wife and his brother together, nothing that could soften the blow of what he'd just witnessed. Finally, Jake's voice broke the silence, raw and edged with pain. The sound of it felt like a slap, each word cutting deeper than the last. I flinched as he demanded answers, each question hanging heavy in the air, accusations and pleas woven together in a heartbreaking tone. I could hear the anger in his voice, but beneath it, there was something even worse, a profound sadness that made my chest ache. I had done this, created this agony, and there was no way to take it back. Beside me, Mike stood silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. The weight of guilt was clear on his face, but he seemed as lost as I was. He didn't try to defend himself. He knew as well as I did that there was no excuse. Jake's gaze shifted between us, and I could feel the betrayal cutting deeper as he looked at his own brother, someone he had trusted his whole life. I knew that this betrayal ran even deeper for Jake. It wasn't just a broken marriage, but a broken bond with the very family he thought he could always rely on. Jake's anger started to escalate, his voice rising, and I could feel the tension thickening in the air. Part of me wanted to tell him everything, to lay bare all the reasons, the emotions, the mistakes that had led to this moment. But I knew it would sound hollow, like trying to patch a sinking ship with bandages. Nothing I could say would make this better. All I would be doing was adding to the pain, giving words to things that were better left unsaid. The confrontation seemed to drag on endlessly, each moment more painful than the last. I could see the conflict raging inside Jake as he struggled to make sense of what had happened. He was hurt and betrayed, but there was a look of utter devastation in his eyes that made my heart break. I wanted to reach out, to somehow comfort him, but I knew that my touch would only make it worse. I had betrayed him in the worst way possible, and there was no coming back from that. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jake's voice broke, cracking under the weight of his own emotions. His last words hung in the air like a dark cloud, a mixture of anger, sadness, and finality that felt like the closing of a door. As he turned and walked out of the room, a sense of emptiness settled over me. The silence returned, heavier than ever, and I was left standing there with Mike, both of us trapped in the ruins of what we had done, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. After Jake left, the house fell into an eerie stillness. It was as if his departure had drained all the warmth and familiarity from the place, leaving only an empty shell of what had once been our home. I felt hollow, like a part of me had been stripped away. I could hardly process what had just happened. It was too raw, too heavy. Every corner of the room seemed to echo with reminders of the life we'd built together, the years of love, trust, and memories that I had shattered in an instant. I sank into a chair, numb, my thoughts spiraling into a dark tunnel of regret and self-loathing. The guilt was suffocating, pressing down on me until I felt like I could barely breathe. I knew this was my fault, that every ounce of Jake's pain was something I had caused. The weight of my choices felt unbearable, each memory with Mike now tainted with the knowledge of the betrayal I'd inflicted on the one person who had loved me unconditionally. All those stolen moments, the thrill of sneaking around, they felt meaningless now, swallowed up by the magnitude of the hurt I had caused. I had been selfish, thinking only of the excitement, the rush. But now, all I felt was a deep, gnawing emptiness. Mike stayed for a while, hovering in silence, unsure of what to say or do. He looked just as shaken as I felt, the reality of our actions finally hitting him too. But the bond between us felt different now, hollow, as though it had withered in the face of the damage we had caused. I knew that what we had shared wasn't love, it was a toxic mix of impulsive attraction and recklessness. It wasn't worth the ruin it had brought upon us. Eventually he muttered something about needing to leave, and I watched him go without a word. Once he was gone, I was left alone with nothing but the echoes of my choices. The days that followed were a blur. Jake had moved out, taking only a few essentials, and left me in the house alone. I would sit for hours in silence, barely eating, barely sleeping, haunted by the emptiness of the rooms around me. The once familiar walls now felt foreign, as though they held the weight of all my mistakes, watching and waiting for me to break. I was trapped with my thoughts, forced to confront the reality of my betrayal in ways I had never considered before. I replayed that awful day in my mind over and over, each time trying to make sense of how I had let things spiral so far. How had I allowed myself to betray someone who had always been there for me, who had trusted me so completely? The guilt was relentless, gnawing at me every moment. I thought of reaching out to Jake, apologizing, explaining, but each time I stopped, realizing that nothing I could say would ever undo the damage. I knew I had lost him, and with him, I had lost a part of myself that I'd never get back. The isolation weighed on me heavily. I tried to reach out to a couple of friends, but the shame was overwhelming. I felt unworthy of sympathy, as though I had brought all this misery upon myself. The knowledge that my actions had torn a family apart only added to the weight I carried. I had fractured not only my marriage but also the bond between Jake and Mike. I knew the betrayal would linger, a wound that would be slow to heal, if it ever did. As the days dragged on, I was left to face the consequences alone, grappling with the realization that my pursuit of fleeting excitement had cost me the stability and love that had once been my entire world. The thrill I'd chased was gone, and in its place was only regret, a profound emptiness that felt as if it would never leave. I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I had shattered, knowing that the path back was one I'd have to walk alone. In the aftermath of it all, life felt bleak and surreal. Days blended together, each one a reminder of what I had lost and the damage I had caused. Without Jake, the house seemed almost haunted, filled with silent reminders of our past life together. The laughter, the warmth, the shared dreams, all of it felt as distant as another lifetime. I went through the motions, but every task seemed pointless, every moment hollow. My mind kept replaying the events that had led to this point, and with each replay, my regret deepened. I could feel the weight of the emptiness settle over me. There was no one to blame but myself, and that was a hard truth to face. I had betrayed not only Jake but also my own values, everything I once thought I stood for. The thrill I had chased with Mike now felt foolish, even shameful. I wondered how I could have allowed myself to be so consumed by it, to risk everything that truly mattered for something so fleeting. The harshness of that realization left me feeling raw, exposed, and deeply remorseful. Friends and family slowly began to hear about what happened, and the judgment was swift. People who had once been close kept their distance, either out of loyalty to Jake or out of sheer disappointment in me. I was suddenly the outsider, the one who had brought chaos and betrayal into a circle that had once been filled with trust and respect. The whispers, the looks, all of it weighed heavily on me. I could sense the resentment and the pity, and it only intensified my feelings of isolation. For the first time, I truly understood how profound an impact my actions had on everyone around me, not just on Jake or Mike, but on the entire network of people who had been affected by this betrayal. I tried to reach out to Jake, hoping for even a sliver of forgiveness, or at least a chance to explain, but he had made it clear he wanted nothing more to do with me. I couldn't blame him. What could I possibly say that would change anything? No words could erase the hurt I had caused. In every message I tried to send, I found myself deleting it, realizing that nothing would undo the damage. He deserved better than the pain I had brought into his life, and the best thing I could do was to respect his space and let him heal. As the weeks dragged on, I began to reflect on what led me to such a destructive path. I had chased excitement, ignoring the deep-seated issues within myself that I hadn't addressed. I had mistaken thrill for happiness, risking stability and love for a rush that quickly evaporated. The realization was a bitter one, forcing me to confront parts of myself I had avoided for years. I realized I had to start the difficult journey of understanding why I had made those choices, why I had been so willing to hurt the person I loved, and why I had prioritized fleeting desires over real commitment. There was no easy path forward, no quick solution to erase what I had done. Each day I found myself trying to rebuild a sense of self, one piece at a time, acknowledging the pain I had caused and learning to live with it. I knew it would be a long, lonely road, but it was the only way to truly confront my actions. Jake would likely never forgive me, and I would have to live with that. But as painful as it was, I knew that the path of self-reflection and accountability was the only way to move forward. And maybe, just maybe, one day I would find a way to forgive myself,